We know you guys love these stories, but most of you listening aren't subscribing. Our subs have been quite low this month, and we're really close to 20,000 subscribers, so please be a legend and smash the subscribe button. And like this video, it will really help support us. Thank you so much.
I've always been a car guide, dreaming of owning something fast and flashy. When I spotted a BMW M3 on Craigslist for just $10,000, I couldn't believe my luck. The ad was vague with only a couple of blurry photos, but the price was unbeatable. I messaged the seller, a guy named Mike, and we agreed to meet in a grocery store parking lot. When I arrived, I was blown away. The car was gorgeous, sleek black paint, perfect condition, not a scratch on it. Mike seemed anxious to sell, mentioning something about moving out of state. The test drive was incredible. The M3 handled like a dream, its engine purring as we zipped through back roads. I was sold before we even got back to the parking lot. We haggled a bit, and I ended up getting it for $9,500. I couldn't stop grinning as I drove my new car home. For the next few weeks, I was in heaven. I took the long way to work, volunteered for every errand just to have an excuse to drive. My friends were jealous, constantly asking for rides. I felt like I'd won the lottery. But then things started getting weird. I noticed a black SUV following me a few times. At first, I brushed it off as paranoia, but it kept happening. One Saturday, while I was washing the M3 in my driveway, two men in suits approached me. They flashed badges, introducing themselves as detectives. They started grilling me about where I got the car. I told them about Mike and the Craigslist ad, but as I was talking, I realized how little I actually knew about him. The detectives exchanged looks, and my stomach dropped. They explained that the M3 had been involved in a homicide case. It had been used as a getaway car in a murder 6 months ago. The original owner had reported it stolen, but now they suspected he might have been involved in the crime. I felt sick. The detectives said they needed to impound the car as evidence. I protested, telling them how much I'd paid, but it was useless. I watched helplessly as they called a tow truck and hauled away my dream car. The next few days were a blur. I couldn't stop thinking about the car and the murder. I scoured local news sites for information about the crime, but found nothing. I kept replaying my meeting with Mike, trying to remember if there had been any red flags. A week later, I got a call from one of the detectives asking me to come to the station. When I arrived, they led me to an interview room. The detective explained they'd made progress in the case but needed my help filling in some gaps. He showed me crime scene photos. I felt nauseous looking at them, knowing my car had been involved. Then he pulled out a picture of Mike. Only the detective said his real name was Alex, and he was a cousin of the original owner. The story started to unfold. The original owner, James, had owed money to some dangerous people. When he couldn't pay, things had gotten violent. James had used the M3 to flee after a murder, then reported the car stolen to cover his tracks. He'd given the car to his cousin Alex to dispose of it. But Alex, seeing a chance to make some quick cash, had decided to sell the car instead. That's where I came in. The detective explained they believed I was an innocent buyer, but they needed to be certain I wasn't involved. I spent hours at the station going over every detail of the purchase and my interactions with Alex/Mike. By the time I left, I was exhausted and overwhelmed. The detectives said they'd try to recover my money, but warned it might take a while. Over the next few months, I was called in for more interviews and even had to testify in court. I learned more about the case than I ever wanted to know. James had been arrested trying to flee the country. Alex was facing charges for obstruction of justice and selling stolen property. As for me, I was cleared of any wrongdoing, but that didn't make me feel much better. I was still out nearly 10 grand and had no car to show for it. The legal process dragged on, and it seemed less likely they'd ever see my money again. The worst part was the paranoia. I found myself constantly looking over my shoulder, worried that James' dangerous associates might come looking for the car or anyone connected to it. Even though the detective assured me I was safe, I couldn't shake the feeling of unease. 6 months after the car was seized, there was a breakthrough in the case. The police had managed to trace the murder weapon to one of James's associates. With this new evidence, both James and Alex accepted plea deals. I was called to testify one last time. Sitting in the courtroom, I saw James and Alex for the first time. James looked hardened and unrepentant, while Alex seemed scared and out of his depth. As I gave my testimony, I could feel James' eyes boring into me. I tried to stay calm, but my voice shook as I recounted how I'd bought the car. After the hearing, the detective pulled me aside. He said that with the case wrapping up, they were going to auction off the M3. As the last registered owner, I had the right to bid on it. Part of me was tempted. Despite everything, I still loved that car, but the thought of driving it again, knowing its history, made me uneasy. The money I got from the auction didn't cover what I had originally paid, but it was something. As I watched the M3 being driven away by its new owner, I felt a mix of relief and sadness. I still think about that M3 sometimes, wondering where it ended up and hoping its new owner has better luck with it than I did. As for me, I'm content with my modest but honest set of wheels. It might not turn heads like that M3 did, but at least I know its history. And in the end, peace of mind is worth more than any flashy car. The case might be closed, but the memories of those intense months still linger. Every time I see a black M3 on the road, I can't help but wonder about its story. And whenever I browse Craigslist now, I'm a lot more skeptical about deals that seem too good to be true. Last week, I decided it was time to replace my old, worn-out couch. I've been browsing Craigslist for a while, looking for a good deal on a used sofa. After scrolling through countless listings of stained, sagging, and overpriced furniture, I finally found what seemed like the perfect match. A leather sectional in gray condition, and the price was right. The photo showed a sleek, dark brown couch that would fit perfectly in my living room. The seller's description mentioned that it was only 2 years old and barely used, which seemed too good to be true for the asking price. But I figured it was worth checking out, so I sent a message expressing my interest. The seller, a woman named Sarah, responded quickly. We exchanged a few messages, and she seemed friendly and straightforward. She explained that she was moving out of state for a new job and needed to get rid of some furniture quickly. It all sounded reasonable, and we agreed to meet at her apartment the next day. I was excited about the prospect of finally upgrading my living room and getting such a great deal. As I drove to her place, I imagined how much better my apartment would look with this new addition. When I arrived at Sarah's building, I took a moment to look around. It was a nice area with well-maintained buildings and neatly landscaped gardens. Nothing seemed out of place or suspicious. I rang the buzzer, and Sarah let me in. As I climbed the stairs to her third-floor apartment, I could hear the faint sound of a tea playing and smell something cooking. It all felt very normal and domestic. Sarah greeted me at the door with a smile. She was a middle-aged woman with short blonde hair and glasses, dressed casually in jeans and a t-shirt. She invited me in to take a look at the couch, and I followed her into the living room. The apartment was sparsely furnished, with a few boxes scattered around, supporting her story about moving. The sectional was right there in the middle of the room, and it looked even better in person than it did in the photos. I ran my hand over the smooth leather, checked for any tears or stains, and sat down to test its comfort. It was perfect, exactly what I had been looking for. Sarah and I chatted while I inspected the sofa. She told me more about her new job and asked about my plans for the couch. The conversation was pleasant and unremarkable. After agreeing on the price, I called my buddy Mike to help me load it into my truck. While we waited for him to arrive, Sarah offered me a glass of water, and we continued to make small talk. She seemed in a bit of a hurry to finish the transaction, but I figured she was just busy with her move. There were more boxes in the hallway, and she mentioned having a lot to do before her flight in a few days. When Mike arrived, we got to work. It took some maneuvering to get the sectional down the narrow staircase, but we managed without too much trouble. Sarah helped by holding doors open and directing us around tight corners. Once we had the couch secured in my truck, I paid Sarah and we said our goodbyes. She thanked me for taking the sofa off her hands and wished me well. As Mike and I drove away, we talked about what a great deal I'd gotten and how smooth the whole process had been. I was feeling pretty good about my purchase and looking forward to getting it set up in my place. The drive home was uneventful, with Mike and I playing a gaming session and breaking the new couch. Back at my apartment, Mike helped me unload the sectional and get it up to my second-floor unit. It was a struggle, involving some creative angling and a lot of grunting, but we finally managed to get it through the door. We spent the next hour or so arranging and rearranging the pieces until I was satisfied with the layout. Mike left shortly after, and I stood back to admire my new living room centerpiece. It really did transform the space, making my modest apartment feel more sophisticated and comfortable. Feeling pretty pleased with myself, I decided to relax and enjoy my new purchase. I grabbed a cold beer from the fridge, found the TV remote, and settled into the soft leather cushions. As I shifted to get comfortable, I felt something hard underneath one of the seat cushions. At first, I thought it might be the TV remote I had just set down, or maybe some loose change that had fallen out of my pocket during the move. Without much thought, I reached under the cushion to investigate. My hand wrapped around something cold and metallic, much larger than a remote or some coins. A chill ran down my spine as I slowly pulled out what I realized was a gun. Not just any gun, but a loaded handgun. The weight of it in my hand made my stomach drop. I froze, holding it in my trembling hands, trying to process what was happening. The TV droned on in the background, but all I could hear was the pounding of my heart in my ears. A million thoughts raced through my mind. How did this get here? Did Sarah know about it? Was it hers? Or did it belong to someone else? I started to panic, wondering if I had unknowingly gotten myself involved in something dangerous. Had Sarah been trying to get rid of evidence? Was she mixed up in some kind of criminal activity? Or was she as unaware of the gun as I had been? I thought back to our interaction, trying to remember if there had been any red flags I'd missed. I carefully placed the gun on the coffee table and stepped back, unsure of what to do next. Part of me wanted to pretend I'd never found it, to shove it back under the cushion and forget about it. But I knew that wasn't an option. This was serious, and I couldn't just ignore it. After a few minutes of pacing and debating, I knew I had to call the police. This wasn't something I could handle on my own, and I didn't want to risk getting caught up in anything illegal. With shaky hands, I dialed 911 and explained the situation to the dispatcher. She was calm and professional, asking me to describe the gun and confirm that I hadn't moved it since finding it. She assured me that officers would be there soon and instructed me not to touch the weapon again. I hung up and sat on the edge of my armchair, keeping a wary eye on the gun as if it might suddenly come to life. The wait for the police felt like an eternity. Every sound from the hallway made me jump, half expecting someone to burst through my door demanding the gun back. I kept glancing between the weapon on the table and my phone, willing it to ring with news that this was all a big misunderstanding. When the knock finally came, I nearly leaped out of my skin. I checked the peephole to confirm it was indeed the police before opening the door. 2 officers entered my apartment, their presence both reassuring and intimidating. They listened to my story, asking for details about where I bought the couch and who had sold it to me. One officer examined the gun while the other took notes on my statement. They were professional, but I could sense their interest peaking as I described the transaction with Sarah. The officer handling the gun carefully unloaded it and ran the serial number through their system. They took it away and told me I was okay. Alright, so here's what happened when I tried to sell my old TV on Craigslist. It was a Saturday morning, and I just finished my coffee when I decided to finally get rid of that bulky old flat screen taking up space in my living room. It still worked fine, but I upgraded to a newer model and figured someone else could use it. I snapped a few pictures, trying to make it look as appealing as possible. You know how it is with Craigslist. People want to see every angle before they commit. I wrote up a quick description, mentioning the size, brand, and that it was in good condition. Then I hit post and went on my day, not thinking much of it. A couple days went by, and I'd almost forgotten about the ad when I got a message. Some guy named Mike was interested and wanted to come take a look. We messaged back and forth a bit, settling on a time for him to come over. Wednesday evening around 7 p.m. I figured that was perfect, still daylight, but after work hours. Wednesday rolled around, and I found myself tidying up the house a bit. Not that it mattered for selling a TV, but I guess it's just habit when you're expecting company. As 7 p.m. approached, I started feeling a little nervous. It's always a bit weird having a stranger come to your house, you know. Right on time, I heard a knock at the door. I took a deep breath and went to answer it. There stood Mike, average height, maybe in his mid-40s, with thinning hair and a bit of a beer belly. He smiled and introduced himself, seeming friendly enough. I invited him in and led him to the living room where the TV was set up. At first, everything seemed normal. Mike looked over the TV, asked a few questions about its features and how old it was. But then I started noticing little things that made me uneasy, like how his eyes would linger on me a bit too long when I was explaining something, or how he'd find excuses to step closer to me, invading my personal space. I tried to brush it off, telling myself I was just being paranoid. But as time went on, it became harder to ignore. Mike started asking questions that had nothing to do with the TV. He wanted to know if I lived alone, if I was single, what I did for fun. His tone was overly friendly, almost flirtatious, and it made my skin crawl. I kept trying to steer the conversation back to the TV, but Mike was persistent. He'd make comments about how nice my place was, or how he bet I was popular with the guys. At one point, he even reached out and touched my arm while laughing at something he'd said. I flinched away, hoping he'd get the hint. But he didn't. Instead, Mike seemed to take my discomfort as a challenge. He started moving around the room, looking at my things, picking up photos and knickknacks. I felt like he was invading my privacy, but I didn't know how to ask him to stop without seeming rude. As he was examining the TV again, Mike accidentally bumped into me. I could feel him press against my back for a moment before I quickly stepped away. My heart was racing, and I knew I needed to get him out of my house. I started talking about the price, hoping to wrap things up. Mike agreed to buy the TV, but he was in no hurry to leave. He kept finding more questions to ask, more reasons to linger. I was getting more anxious by the minute, wishing I'd asked a friend to be here with me. Finally, after what felt like hours but was probably only about 45 minutes, I managed to get Mike moving towards the door. But even then, he wouldn't let up. As we were carrying the TV to his car, he asked for my number, saying we should hang out sometime. I mumbled something about being busy and hoped he'd take the hint. But Mike was persistent. He stood by his car, trying to keep the conversation going. I was torn between not wanting to be rude and desperately wanting him to leave. I made up an excuse about having plans and needing to get ready, practically pushing him towards his car. As Mike finally drove away, I rushed back inside and locked the door. My hands were shaking as I double-checked all the locks. I felt violated somehow, even though nothing had technically happened. Just the way he had looked at me and acted made me feel gross and scared. I spent the rest of the night jumping at every little noise, convinced Mike was going to come back. I kept replaying the evening in my head, wondering if I had done something to encourage him. But I knew deep down that wasn't true. Mike had chosen to act that way regardless of anything I did. The next few days were tense. I found myself constantly looking out the window, half expecting to see Mike's car parked on the street. A couple times I thought I saw him driving by, but I couldn't be sure if it was really him or just my paranoia. I didn't feel safe in my own home anymore. I started sleeping with a chair propped under my bedroom doorknob, just in case. During the day, I kept all the curtains closed and jumped every time my phone buzzed with a notification. It took about a week before I started to feel somewhat normal again. But even then, the experience had changed me. I became much more cautious about online interactions. I installed a security system and started being more aware of my surroundings when I was out. There were so many obvious reasons to why this guy was a bad vibe, but I ignored them because I didn't want to seem rude or overreact. It's a lesson I won't forget anytime soon. Now, I always meet in public places for online sales, and I make sure someone knows where I am. What started as a simple attempt to sell an old TV turned into a frightening encounter that left me feeling vulnerable and scared in my own home. It's something I'll always remember when dealing with strangers online. I was just a college student looking to make some extra cash. Scrolling through Craigslist, I stumbled upon a babysitting ad that seemed perfect. The pay was better than I expected, and it was only for a few hours. Without hesitation, I reached out. Mrs. Cooper, the woman who posted the ad, sounded charming over the phone. We chatted briefly, and she seemed genuinely excited to have found someone to watch her son, Tommy. We agreed on a time, and I felt a sense of relief wash over me. Finally, a way to ease my financial stress. The day of the job arrived, and I made my way to Mrs. Cooper's house. It was in a quiet neighborhood, nothing out of the ordinary. As I walked up to the front door, I noticed how well-maintained the garden was. Mrs. Cooper clearly took pride in her home. She greeted me with a warm smile, ushering me inside. The house was immaculate, with family photos lining the walls. Mrs. Cooper explained that Tommy was already asleep upstairs, and that she'd be out for a few hours. She gave me a quick tour of the main floor, showing me where the snacks were and how to work the TV. Before leaving, she handed me a generous amount of cash, even more than we'd agreed upon. As soon as the front door closed behind Mrs. Cooper, an eerie silence fell over the house. I tried to shake off the uneasy feeling creeping up my spine. I settled onto the couch and flipped through channels trying to distract myself. After about an hour, I heard a faint noise coming from upstairs. At first, I thought it might be Tommy waking up. I listened closely, but the sound was odd, not quite like a child stirring from sleep. It was more like a scratching or scraping noise. I hesitated, unsure if I should check on Tommy. Mrs. Cooper hadn't given me any specific instructions about going upstairs. But as the noise continued, my curiosity got the better of me. I slowly made my way up the stairs, my heart pounding in my chest. The upper floor was dark, and I used my phone's flashlight to navigate the hallway. I checked each room, expecting to find Tommy's bedroom, but every room was empty. No toys, no kids' furniture, nothing to indicate a child lived here. The scratching noise grew louder as I approached the end of the hallway. That's when I noticed a small cord hanging from the ceiling, the entrance to the attic. The sound was definitely coming from up there. My instincts were screaming at me to turn back, to leave the house immediately, but part of me needed to know what was going on. With trembling hands, I pulled down the attic stairs. The attic was pitch black. I swept my phone's light across the space, and what I saw made my blood run cold. The walls were covered in newspaper clippings and photos of young women. Some photos had red X's drawn over them. In the corner, there was a small table with restraints attached to it. I felt sick to my stomach. This couldn't be real. I had to be dreaming. But the musty smell of the attic and the sound of my own ragged breathing told me this was all too real. Suddenly, I heard footsteps on the stairs below. Mrs. Cooper was back. Panic set in as I realized I was trapped in the attic. I frantically looked around for a way out, but there were no windows, no other exits. I heard Mrs. Cooper calling my name, her voice sickly sweet. She was coming up the attic stairs. I pressed myself into a corner, praying she wouldn't find me in the darkness. But as her head appeared at the top of the stairs, her eyes locked onto mine. The friendly facade was gone, replaced by a cold, calculating stare. She smiled, but it wasn't the warm smile from earlier. This was the grin of a predator who had cornered its prey. "I see you've been exploring," she said, her voice unnervingly calm. "That's okay. Most of you curious types can't help yourselves." My mind raced, trying to process what was happening. There was no Tommy. There never was. This whole thing had been a trap, and I had walked right into it. Mrs. Cooper took a step towards me, and I saw she was holding something behind her back. I didn't wait to find out what it was. Adrenaline kicked in, and I lunged forward, pushing past her with all my strength. I stumbled down the attic stairs, nearly falling in my haste. I could hear Mrs. Cooper right behind me, her calm demeanor now replaced with angry shouts. I ran down the hallway, taking the stairs two at a time. My hand fumbled with the front door lock, precious seconds ticking by as I struggled to open it. Just as I felt Mrs. Cooper's hand grasp my shoulder, the lock clicked and I wrenched the door open. I ran out into the street, not daring to look back. My lungs burned as I sprinted down the block, Mrs. Cooper's shouts fading behind me. I didn't stop running until I reached a busy intersection several blocks away. Gasping for air, I pulled out my phone with shaking hands and called the police. As I waited for them to arrive, my mind reeled from what had just happened. The fake babysitting ad, the non-existent child, the horrifying attic, it all seemed like something out of a nightmare. Over the next few hours, the truth began to unfold. Mrs. Cooper, whose real name was Ellen Murdoch, had been using Craigslist to lure young women to her house for years. Some of her victims had never been seen again. The attic was full of evidence linking her to multiple disappearances in the area. As the sun began to rise, I sat in the police station, getting my official statement. The detectives told me I was lucky to have escaped. They found a taser in the house, likely what Mrs. Cooper had been holding behind her back when she cornered me in the attic. In the days and weeks that followed, I struggled to come to terms with what had happened. Nightmares plagued my sleep, and I jumped at every unexpected noise. I couldn't shake the image of those photos in the attic or the cold look in Mrs. Cooper's eyes when she found me there. The case made headlines, and more victims came forward. It turned out that Mrs. Cooper had been operating in different cities, always using the same babysitting ruse to attract young women. The full extent of her crimes was still being uncovered. As for me, I tried to return to my normal life, but things were different now. I found myself constantly looking over my shoulder, second-guessing every interaction with strangers. The world suddenly seemed like a much darker, more dangerous place. I never thought I'd find myself in a real-life horror story, but that's exactly what happened when I posted an ad on Craigslist for a new roommate. My name's Jake, and I was just looking for someone to split the rent with in my two-bedroom apartment. Nothing fancy, you know. When Tyler responded to my ad, I was relieved. He seemed normal enough, clean-cut, polite, and had a steady job. We met up for coffee, hit it off, and I decided to give him a shot. He moved in the following week, and at first, everything was great. Tyler paid his share of the rent on time, kept the common areas tidy, and was generally a quiet, considerate roommate. but after a few weeks, I started noticing some odd things. Tyler would disappear for days at a time without any explanation. When he was home, his schedule was all over the place. I'd hear him shuffling around the apartment at weird hours of the night, sometimes muttering to himself. I tried to brush it off, thinking maybe he just had a quirky job or something. One night, I woke up to use the bathroom and saw a sliver of light under Tyler's door. I heard him talking softly, but it didn't sound like he was on the phone. It was more like he was having a conversation with himself. I stood there for a moment, listening, but couldn't make out what he was saying. It gave me the creeps, so I hurried back to my room. The next day, I casually asked Tyler if everything was okay, mentioning that I heard him up late. He just shrugged it off, saying he had trouble sleeping sometimes. But something about the way he looked at me made me uneasy. It was like he was trying to figure out how much I heard. As the weeks went by, Tyler's behavior got stranger. He'd come home looking disheveled, with dirt on his clothes and scratches on his arms. Once, I could have sworn I saw what looked like dried blood on his shoes. When I asked about it, he mumbled something about helping a friend move furniture and quickly disappeared into his room. I started paying more attention to the news, half expecting to hear about some crime that might explain Tyler's odd behavior. But there was nothing out of the ordinary reported. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was seriously wrong. One afternoon, while Tyler was out, I decided to do some snooping. I know it was wrong, but I was getting seriously freaked out. His room was surprisingly neat, almost too clean. As I was about to leave, I'd noticed a closet door with a small padlock on it. Who puts a lock on a closet in a rented apartment? My curiosity got the better of me. I found a paperclip, and after a few tries, managed to pick the lock. What I found inside made my blood run cold. The closet was filled with stacks of newspapers and manila folders. At first glance, it looked like the work of an obsessive researcher or journalist. But as I started flipping through the papers, I realized it was so much worse. There were missing persons flyers, dozens of them, all with dates and locations carefully noted. Newspaper clippings about unsolved murders with certain details highlighted. And then I saw the box. It was a simple shoebox, but when I had opened it, I felt I was going to be sick. Inside were what could only be described as trophies: a woman's necklace, a child's toy, a man's watch. Each item had a small tag attached with a date and initials. I don't know how long I stood there, frozen in shock. It was like my brain couldn't process what I was seeing. This couldn't be real. My roommate, the guy I'd been living with for months, couldn't be some kind of serial killer. But the evidence was right there in front of me. Suddenly, I heard the front door open. Tyler was home. In a panic, I quickly shoved everything back into the closet, fumbling with the lock. I barely made it out of his room and into the kitchen before he walked in. Tyler gave me a weird look, probably because I was standing in the kitchen, breathing heavily and looking like I'd seen a ghost. Which, in a way, I had. I mumbled something about feeling sick and rushed to my room. That night, I lay awake, my mind racing. What was I supposed to do? Go to the police? But with what evidence? I'd broken into Tyler's room and gone through his private stuff. Plus, what if I was wrong? What if there was some innocent explanation for all of this? The next morning, I woke up to find Tyler had left early. I breathed a sigh of relief, but my mind was still reeling from what I had discovered. I decided to do some research of my own. I started by looking up the names and dates from the missing persons flyers I'd seen in Tyler's closet. I spent the entire day glued to my laptop, cross-referencing dates and locations. By the time Tyler came home that evening, I was convinced that my roommate was responsible for at least a dozen missing persons cases. The next few days were a blur of anxiety and fear. I tried to act normal around Tyler, but I'm sure he could tell something was off. I started making plans to move out, telling him I'd gotten a job offer in another city. He seemed disappointed, but didn't question it too much. As I packed up my things, I debated whether to leave an anonymous tip for the police. In the end, I decided I had to. I couldn't live with myself if I didn't at least try to do something. The night before I was set to move out, I heard Tyler leave the apartment around midnight. Curiosity got the better of me, and I decided to follow him. I know it was stupid and dangerous, but I felt like I needed to know the truth. I followed Tyler's car at a distance, making sure to stay far enough back that he wouldn't notice me. We drove for about an hour, heading into a rural area outside the city. Finally, Tyler pulled off onto a dirt road that led into a dense forest. I parked my car on the side of the main road and continued on foot, using the flashlight on my phone to guide me. The forest was dark and eerily quiet. After about 10 minutes of walking, I saw a faint light through the trees. As I got closer, I could make out a small cabin. Tyler's car was parked outside. I crept up to one of the windows, my heart pounding so loud I was sure Tyler would hear it. What I saw inside the cabin will haunt me for the rest of my life. Tyler was there, but he wasn't alone. There was a young woman tied to a chair, clearly terrified. Tyler was pacing back and forth, talking to himself in that same muttering voice I heard through his bedroom door. I wanted to run to call the police to do something, but I was frozen in place, watching this nightmare unfold. Suddenly, Tyler turned towards the window. For a split second, our eyes met. I saw the recognition in his face, followed by a look of pure rage. I ran. I ran faster than I'd ever run in my life, stumbling through the dark forest, branches scratching my face and arms. I could hear Tyler crashing through the underbrush behind me, getting closer. Somehow, I made it back to my car. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely get the key in the ignition. As I sped away, I saw Tyler emerge from the forest in my rearview mirror, standing in the middle of the road, watching me drive away. I drove straight to the police station, still in shock from what I'd witnessed. I told them everything about the closet, the missing persons flyers, the trophies, and what I'd seen at the cabin. I was scrolling through Craigslist, desperately searching for any job I could find. My savings were almost gone, and I was behind on rent. That's when I saw the ad. Personal assistant needed. Excellent pay. The salary listed was more than double what I had been making at my old job. It seemed too good to be true, but I was desperate. I sent in my resume, figuring I had nothing to lose. To my shock, I got an email back the very next day. The sender, Ryan, wanted to set up an interview right away. I was thrilled but also nervous. The ad hadn't given many details about the actual job duties. I showed up for the interview at a small office building downtown. Brian greeted me with a warm smile. He was older than I expected, maybe in his late 40s, with graying hair and intense blue eyes. As we talked, I noticed he kept asking really personal questions that didn't seem relevant to the job. He wanted to know if I lived alone, if I had family nearby, even about my dating life. It made me a bit uncomfortable, but I was so eager to impress him that I answered everything. Brian emphasized over and over how important discretion would be in this role. He said I'd need to keep all aspects of the work completely confidential. When I tried to ask for more specifics about what I'd actually be doing, he was pretty vague. Just general assistant duties, he said. Running errands, handling paperwork, that kind of thing. Looking back, I should have seen the red flags, but I was so relieved to have a job prospect that I ignored my unease. When Brian offered me the position on the spot, I accepted without hesitation. The salary was just too good to pass up. For the first couple weeks, everything seemed normal enough. Brian had me doing typical assistant tasks, answering emails, organizing his schedule, picking up dry cleaning. But then things started to get strange. It began with Brian sending me on odd errands. He had me go to unfamiliar parts of town to pick up unmarked packages for people I'd never met. Once I had to drive 3 hours to drop off an envelope full of cash at an abandoned gas station. When I asked Brian what was in the packages or who the money was for, he'd get really agitated and remind me about the confidentiality agreement I'd signed. I started to get a sinking feeling in my stomach. What had I gotten myself into? Was I unknowingly participating in something illegal? I thought about quitting, but the money was so good. I had already told my family and friends about my amazing new job. I didn't want to admit I'd made a huge mistake. But things kept escalating. Brian had me rent storage units under false names. He had me drive rental cars to random locations in the middle of the night. One time I'm pretty sure I saw guns in one of the packages. I knew I was in way over my head. I tried to convince myself that maybe Brian was just eccentric. Maybe he was involved in some kind of top-secret government work, but deep down I knew that wasn't true. The sick feeling in my stomach grew stronger every day. Then came the night that changed everything. Brian called me at 2 a.m. saying he needed me to come to the office right away. When I arrived, he was visibly agitated. He shoved a duffel bag into my arms and told me to drive it to an address 2 hours away. He said it was urgent and I couldn't ask any questions. As I drove through the dark, empty streets, my hands were shaking on the steering wheel. I couldn't stop thinking about what might be in that bag. Drugs. Weapons. Something even worse, I felt like I was going to be sick. When I reached the address, it turned out to be an abandoned warehouse. A man I'd never seen before was waiting there. He took the bag from me without a word and handed me a thick envelope. I didn't need to open it to know it was full of cash. On the drive back, I finally admitted to myself that I couldn't keep doing this. Whatever Brian was involved in, it was dangerous and illegal. I had to get out before I ended up in prison, or worse. The next morning, I went to Brian's office planning to quit. But as soon as I started talking, his whole demeanor changed. His eyes went cold, and he started listing off all the illegal activities I'd been involved in. Activities I hadn't even realized were illegal at the time. He made it crystal clear that if I tried to leave, he'd implicate me in everything. Said he had evidence that would send me to prison for years. I felt the blood drain from my face as I realized I was trapped. That was 6 months ago. I'm still working for Brian, terrified of what he might do if I try to leave again. The errands have only gotten more frequent and more suspicious. I'm constantly looking over my shoulder, jumping at every unexpected sound. I can barely sleep at night, plagued by nightmares of police raids and prison cells. I've thought about going to the police, but I'm scared they won't believe me, or that Brian will somehow find out and come after me or my family. He knows where I live, where my parents live. I feel like I'm being watched all the time. Last week, things took an even darker turn. Brian sent me to meet with a new contact, a guy I'd never seen before. As soon as I walked into the meeting spot, I knew something was wrong. The man seemed jumpy and agitated. Halfway through our interaction, he suddenly pulled out a gun. My heart nearly stopped. I was sure I was about to die. But then I heard sirens in the distance, and the man panicked. He shoved the package he was supposed to give me into my hands and took off running. I stood there frozen, holding what I was pretty sure was a kilo of cocaine, as the sound of sirens grew closer. At the last second, my survival instincts kicked in. I ran to my car and sped away, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst out of my chest. When I got home, I was shaking so badly I could barely get my key in the lock. I kept expecting police to show up at any moment, but they never came. The next day, Brian acted like nothing had happened. He never mentioned the botch exchange, but I could see a new coldness in his eyes when he looked at me. I realized that you wouldn't hesitate to sacrifice me if it meant saving himself. Now I spend every day wondering if it will be my last day of freedom. I jump every time my phone rings, terrified it will be Brian with another dangerous errand. Or worse, the police calling to arrest me. I'd never thought selling my old furniture would turn my life upside down. It all started when I decided to move to a new apartment across town. I needed to downsize and make some extra cash, so I listed a bunch of furniture on Craigslist. A guy named Greg responded to my ad pretty quickly. He seemed nice enough over email, and we set up a time for him to come check out the items. When he arrived, I was relieved to see he was just a normal-looking guy in his 30s, dressed in jeans and a plain t-shirt. Greg was polite and chatty as he looked at the furniture, asking about its history and complimenting my taste. He ended up buying a bookshelf, coffee table, and armchair. Since the items were bulky, Greg said he'd need to make a few trips to pick everything up. I was fine with that. It gave me more time to pack up my other stuff. Over the next week, Greg came by 3 or 4 times to collect the furniture pieces. Each time we'd make small talk for a few minutes before he'd load up his truck and head out. He always had a friendly smile and seemed genuinely interested in hearing about my moving plans. After his 3rd visit, I started noticing little things seemed off in my apartment. At first, I brushed it off as moving chaos, but then I realized some of my books had been rearranged on the shelves. A window I always kept locked was suddenly unlocked. My toiletries in the bathroom weren't in their usual spots. I tried to convince myself I was just being paranoid. Moving is stressful, and I figured I was just misremembering where I'd left things. But the uneasy feeling wouldn't go away. I started paying closer attention to my surroundings, making mental notes of where I left things. The day after Greg's final pickup, I was cleaning the spot where the armchair used to be. That's when I saw it, a tiny camera, carefully hidden in the baseboard. My blood ran cold as I realized what was happening. Greg had been using the furniture pickups as an excuse to plant cameras and bugs all over my apartment. With shaking hands, I frantically searched the rest of my place. I found 2 more hidden cameras, one in a living room bookshelf and another in my bedroom closet. Who knows what else I missed? I felt sick thinking about how Greg had violated my privacy and personal space. He'd seen me changing clothes, heard my private phone calls, watched me sleep. I couldn't stop imagining Greg sitting somewhere, watching me on a screen. Had he been doing this the whole time? How much had he seen? The thought made my skin crawl. I felt dirty, exposed, and completely vulnerable in my own home. For the next few days, I was constantly on edge. I kept all the curtains drawn and barely slept. Every little noise made me jump. I was terrified Greg would show up at any moment. I considered calling the police, but what would I tell them? I had no proof it was Greg, and I'd willingly let him into my home multiple times. My fears came true about a week later. I woke up in the middle of the night to use the bathroom. As I walked down the hall, I caught a glimpse of movement in the living room. My heart nearly stopped when I saw Greg standing there, just watching me. He was wearing all black, blending into the shadows. For a moment, we just stared at each other, frozen in shock. I ran back to my room and locked the door, calling the police with shaking hands. I figured Greg moving around in the apartment, opening drawers and closets. By the time the police arrived, sirens blaring, Greg was gone. But he'd left behind more cameras and even a few articles of my clothing. The police took my statement and collected evidence, but said there wasn't much they could do without catching Greg in the act. They suggested I move immediately and get a restraining order. But how could I get a restraining order against someone whose last name I didn't even know? I couldn't stay in that apartment another night. I packed a bag and went to a hotel, too scared to even tell my friends what had happened. I felt ashamed and stupid for letting Greg into my home so many times. How could I have been so naive? Over the next few days, I tried to go about my normal routine, but I constantly felt like I was being watched. I'd catch glimpses of a man who looked like Greg on the street or in store windows, but when I turned to look, he'd be gone. Was I just being paranoid, or was he really following me? I decided to do some digging online. I searched for Greg's email address and phone number, trying to find any information on him. What I discovered chilled me to the bone. Greg wasn't his real name, and he had a history of stalking and harassing women he met online. There were forum posts from other victims describing similar experiences. He gained their trust through online sales, then used that access to plant cameras and gather personal information. Armed with this new information, I went back to the police. They took the case more seriously this time, but warned me that guys like this are often good at covering their tracks. They advised me to change all my passwords, get a new phone number, and be extra cautious about my online presence. I followed their advice, but it didn't feel like enough. I was constantly looking over my shoulder, checking for hidden cameras in every room I entered. I couldn't shake the feeling that Greg was always one step ahead of me. About a month after the initial incident, I came home from work to find my apartment door slightly ajar. My heart raced as I pushed it open, revealing a complete mess inside. Drawers were pulled out, clothes strewn everywhere, furniture overturned. On my bedroom mirror, written in what looked like red lipstick, were the words, "I am always watching." I ran out of the apartment, crying and shaking. I couldn't take it anymore. I felt like I was losing my mind. Was this really happening, or was I imagining it all? I ended up moving in with my sister in another state. I quit my job, changed my name, and deleted all my social media accounts. It felt like the only way to escape Greg's watchful eye. Even now, months later, I still have nightmares about waking up to find Greg in my room. I flinch at unexpected noises and struggle to trust new people. The experience has left me with deep scars, both emotional and psychological. I often wonder if I'll ever feel truly safe again. Will I always be looking over my shoulder, waiting for Greg to reappear, or will I eventually be able to move on and reclaim my life? I never thought selling an old camera would turn my life upside down, but here we are. It all started on a Tuesday evening when I was cleaning out my closet. I came across my old Nikon DSLR, buried under a pile of clothes I'd been meaning to donate. I hadn't used it in years, ever since I got a new phone with a decent camera. No point in keeping it around, I thought. So I snapped a few pictures of the camera and posted an ad on Craigslist. Nothing fancy, just a brief description and my asking price. I didn't think much of it after that, figuring it might take a week or two to get a response. Well, the very next day, I got a message from a guy named Trevor. He seemed pretty interested, asking about the condition and if I'd taken good care of it. We exchanged a few messages, and he came across as a normal, friendly guy. We agreed to meet at a coffee shop near my place that weekend. Saturday rolled around, and I headed to the coffee shop with the camera. Trevor was already there when I arrived, sitting at a table by the window. He looked pretty average, maybe in his mid-30s, brown hair, glasses. Nothing that would make him stand out in a crowd. We made small talk while he checked out the camera. He seemed to know his stuff, asking about specific features and how often I used it. I was impressed. Clearly, this was going to someone who'd appreciate it. What surprised me was that Trevor didn't try to haggle at all. He just pulled out the cash and handed it over. The whole thing took less than 15 minutes. As he left, he thanked me and said he was looking forward to using the camera. I remember thinking it was one of the smoothest Craigslist transactions I'd ever had. A few days passed, and I had almost forgotten about the whole thing. But then, while walking my dog one evening, I spotted a familiar face across the street. It was Trevor, just standing there, looking in my direction. When he saw me notice him, he quickly walked away. I brushed it off as a coincidence. After all, he knew I lived in the area from our meetup. But the next day I saw him again, this time from my kitchen window. He was just standing on the corner, looking at my house. That's when the alarm bells started going off in my head. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe he lived nearby and I just hadn't noticed him before. But deep down I knew something was off. I decided to message Trevor on Craigslist just to see what was up. But when I went to my messages, his profile was gone. Completely vanished like it had never existed. I tried calling the number he'd given me, but it was disconnected. Now I was really freaked out. I started paying more attention to my surroundings, always on the lookout for Trevor. And sure enough, I kept spotting him. Sometimes across the street, sometimes at the local grocery store, always watching me. Then things got even weirder. I started noticing small items missing from my house. At first, it was just little things. A pen from my desk, a coaster from the living room. Stuff I could easily have misplaced. But then more personal items began to disappear. The family photo from my nightstand vanished. My high school yearbook went missing from the bookshelf. My journal, which I kept in my bedside drawer, disappeared without a trace. I was losing my mind. I knew I hadn't misplaced these things, but I couldn't figure out how they were disappearing. I checked all my locks, even installed a new deadbolt. But somehow things kept vanishing. I couldn't sleep. Every little noise had me jumping out of bed, sure I'd catch Trevor in the act. But I never did. Just more missing pieces of my life. After a particularly sleepless night, I decided to go to the police. I told them everything. About the camera sale, Trevor's lurking the missing items. They took a report, but without any proof of a break-in, there wasn't much they could do. They suggested I install security cameras, which I did that very day. But even with the cameras, things kept disappearing. I'd review the footage obsessively, but there was never any sign of intrusion. It was like the items were just vanishing into thin air. I started to question my sanity. Was I imagining things? Was I sleepwalking and hiding my own belongings? But deep down, I knew it was Trevor. Somehow he was getting into my house, my life. I considered moving, but the thought of starting over somewhere new was overwhelming. Plus, who's to say Trevor wouldn't follow me? Weeks passed, and the disappearances continued. It wasn't just small items anymore. My laptop went missing. My passport vanished from its hiding spot. It felt like Trevor was slowly erasing my existence, piece by piece. I became a hermit, afraid to leave my house. I had groceries delivered, worked from home, and kept my curtains drawn at all times. But still, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. One night, about 2 months after the camera sale, I woke up to a noise in my living room. Heart pounding, I grabbed the baseball bat I'd started keeping by my bed and crept down the hallway. And there he was, Trevor, standing in the middle of my living room, holding a framed photo of my family. He looked different from when I first met him, thinner with a wild look in his eyes. Our eyes met, and for a second, neither of us moved. Then he bolted for the door. I chased after him, bat in hand, but he was gone by the time I got outside. I called the cops, but of course there was no sign of him when they arrived. The police took it more seriously this time, given that I'd actually seen Trevor in my house. They increased patrols in my neighborhood and advised me to stay with friends or family for a while. Months have passed now, and I hadn't seen Trevor since that night in my living room. Sometimes I wonder if he's moved on to his next victim, or if he's still out there watching and waiting. I still don't understand why he chose me, why he became so fixated. Was it ever really about the camera, or was I just unlucky enough to catch the eye of someone deeply disturbed? I may never know the answers. All I know is that a simple Craigslist transaction turned into a nightmare that I'm still trying to wake up from. Every time I see a stranger looking at me for a bit too long, or hear an unexpected noise in my house, I'm right back in that moment of terror. Sometimes I think I see him out of the corner of my eye, a glimpse of a familiar face in a crowd, or a figure standing just out of focus. But when I turn to look, there's never anyone there. And somehow that's even more unsettling than seeing it outright.
Thanks for listening in. If you like these stories and want to hear more, then please subscribe and like and support this new channel. We have more stories for you to listen to.